There are several different kinds of ethical theory on offer, some of them intended to apply to any moral context, some of them intended to apply only to moral medical contexts. We can distinguish the more plausible ethical theories in the following way. We have what we can call act-centered approaches, person-centered approaches, and case-centered approaches. Let's look at act-centered approaches first. These are utilitarianism and Kantianism, or speaking more broadly, consequentialism and non-consequentialism. The two are similar and grouped under the same heading of act-centered because they both seek to determine what acts are morally right and wrong, regardless of who performs these acts. They differ in the following respect. Utilitarianism holds that what makes acts right or wrong are the consequences that follow or are likely to follow from the act, while Kantianism holds that it's the reasoning, the guiding principles that motivate a person to perform the act, that make the act right or wrong. As we've said, utilitarian theories hold that consequences are all that matter. But what consequences? The most prominent version of utilitarianism, Mill's version, holds that what makes an act right is that it produces the most happiness for the greatest number affected. We have then the following overarching ethical principle, which has been called the greatest happiness principle, or GHP for short. The greatest happiness principle says that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, i.e. pleasure or absence of pain. Now there are several things to notice here. First, we can ask two different questions. What is the right thing to do? Question 1. Or question 2, is Act A more right than Act B? Presumably, the right thing to do is what will produce the most happiness. But if we are faced with two options, and these are our only two options, then we can also consider whether the first option produces more happiness than the second option, or vice versa. There is a kind of relativity involved here, but note that the principle always stays the same. What is relative is what happens to produce the most happiness for the greatest number. Second, there is a presumption that happiness is pleasure or absence of pain. We can ask what kind of pleasure Mill is talking about. Someone like Jeremy Bentham, whose own utilitarian theory inspired Mill, would say that the relevant pleasure is physical pleasure. Thus, whatever makes the most people feel the most physical pleasure is the right thing to do. But Mill objected to this conception that we would be little different from animals if all that guided us was physical pleasure. Mill distinguished lower, more animalistic sensual pleasures from higher, more intellectual pleasures, and stressed that the higher pleasures are the ones most pertinent to happiness. Mill famously said that it's better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, which expresses the notion that happiness can be attained only through the primary seeking of the higher pleasures, the kind that the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates would find appealing, rather than the lower pleasures. So we have to keep in mind that pleasure can include mental, cognitive delight, as well as the physical pleasing of the senses. There are other kinds of utilitarianism that describe happiness in other ways besides pleasure, like desire satisfaction. We will stick with happiness as pleasure or lack of pain for now and see whether we need to adjust it later. Third, we might ask who we are talking about when we say, quote, the greatest number, unquote. Utilitarians are quite explicit that no one gets privileged. The saying goes, everyone counts as one, no one counts as more than one. A homeless man gets considered as a full person, the Queen of England gets considered as a full person, but no more. This is called impartiality, and is generally counted as a virtue of utilitarian theories. But what about if I'm considering stealing a laptop, and I'm performing the utilitarian calculation? Should I consider the homeless person on the street? How about the Queen of England? When we rehearse the GHP, we should always keep in mind that we are talking about the greatest number of persons affected by the act. Now we can imagine that the Queen of England has shares in the store from whom I'm about to steal the laptop, and in this case she would be affected by my theft. But if she had no real ties to the store, is there a way to make a plausible case that my act would affect her? How about the person on the street? And if so, is it enough of an effect? These are some of the specifics of general utilitarian theories. They deal with consequences, specifically good consequences, Even more specifically, consequences that produce the most happiness, read as pleasure or lack of pain. The right action is the one that produces the most pleasure for the greatest number affected. Notice how strong this claim is, however. Take any action that clearly produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and according to utilitarianism, you have the right action. Take any action that you are certain is the right action, and it will invariably be the one that produces the greatest pleasure for the greatest number affected. Also, take two actions. Action A that produces greater happiness for a greater number than action B, and you will always judge A to be more morally right than B. All on a utilitarian account. Now, can you imagine counterexamples to these claims? Can you imagine an act that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number affected that you would absolutely reject as the right action? Can you imagine an act that you would assert to be the right thing to do with certitude that does not produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number affected? And finally, can you imagine an action that you would deem more morally worthy than a second action, in spite of the fact that the second action produces more happiness for the greatest number affected? There are two versions of utilitarianism that we will discuss in class, versions that emerge as attempts to get around some likely counterexamples. These two versions are called act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. We'll wait until class to say exactly what distinguishes these two versions. Let's turn our attention now to Kantianism, which, if you'll recall, rejects the notion that consequences of actions matter. Ethical theories of this type have also been called non-consequentialism or deontological theory, but since they derive in the work of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant in the 1700s, we call it Kantianism. The term deontological can help us, however, see where this theory differs from utilitarianism. The Greek word deon means duty. Thus, opposed to the notion that consequences make an act right or wrong, in Kantianism, what matters is what someone's moral duties or obligations are. More specifically, someone must perform an act because he or she recognizes it as her duty for the act to be morally right. In other words, one must act from the correct motivations or intentions in order for the act to be right. One feature marking out Kant's theory is that it privileges reason. Kant believed that humans are different from animals, being designed to be purely rational creatures. This doesn't mean that humans are always purely rational, but that they are always such that they can be perfectly rational. When we're trying to determine what actions are morally right or wrong, we are reasoning morally, so Kant argued we should be arguing from our capacity to reason. This means that morally right actions are those that conform to reason, and those that are wrong fail to conform to reason. Beginning from this point, then, Kant argued that reason tells us that each of us should not be privileged over anyone else when trying to determine what actions to perform. If it's morally permissible for me to perform action A in certain circumstances, then it should be permissible for anyone else to perform the same action in the same circumstances. Since we are not primarily interested in the complex justification Kant gives for his theory, we will focus instead on two important elements in Kantian theories that will help guide our thoughts this term. First, one principle emerging from Kant's theory is the following: treat everyone as an end and never merely as a means. Several questions arise here. First, what does the word end mean here? It means something that has value in itself. What does the word means mean here? It means a way to get something that you value in itself. Thus, Kant wants us to value humans for their being human and not merely for how they stand to get us things we value in themselves. Now, notice that he does not say that we should never treat someone as a means. This would be unreasonable. For example, suppose I walk into a bank and wanting to withdraw some money from my account, I think I can remember Kant saying that I should never treat someone as a means. But I did not walk into the bank in order to converse with a teller. My goal is to gain access to my money. The ATM is out of order, let's say, so I stand there unsure of what to do, since I cannot make use of the teller, even as he stands there waiting to help me. I stand like this for hours until they call the police. So I made the common error of thinking that Kant prohibits treating others as means. He says that we mustn't treat others merely as means. This is different from not treating a person as a means at all. What is the difference here? We'll talk in class more about what the difference is. Second, one of the reasons we are supposed always to treat others as ends in themselves is in order to preserve their autonomy. So long as a person is rational, Kant thinks they deserve the amount of respect and freedom necessary for them to make their own decisions. Thus, when we treat someone as a mere means, we shortchange them such respect and freedom and cease to treat them as an autonomous being. This has an interesting consequence. Lying, on Kant's theory, is always wrong. Do you think lying is always wrong? We'll see other dilemmas arise when we try to be consistent about honoring the autonomy of others as we go along.